So I've been playing Final Fantasy IX. So, the time has come to see if I can finally get over my sudden disliking of JRPGs. And what better way to do that than with what I probably consider to be the very best the genre has to offer. I say probably because it's really a four-way tie, and I simply can't decide which one of these games I like best. Anyway, Final Fantasy IX is, as the title may suggest, the 9th entry in the Final Fantasy series. And it is now, when saying this out loud, that I kinda start to realize how ridiculous it is that a series can go on for this long. Now, of course, a series as long as this can only stay relevant by constantly reinventing itself, and Final Fantasy isn't any different. So, according to the now firmly established tradition, it is my duty to inform you of the fact that Final Fantasy IX is kind of a black sheep. I mean, from an art style and vibe standpoint, it doesn't really fit in with many of the other games at all. But at the same time, it's also kind of a throwback to the SNES days of the series. So it sits in kind of a weird place within a series in which every game sits in a weird place. Final Fantasy VII is overrated and darker than the others. Final Fantasy VIII is futuristic and too emo. Final Fantasy XII is basically a single-player MMO, and so on. Every entry in the series has an equal amount of haters and fans. So really, I can only come to the logical conclusion that the series doesn't have a black sheep, and that the extent of an entry being one only lasts until the next game in the series is released. Final Fantasy XIII will continue to suck until Final Fantasy XV will suck in a completely different way. And then all of a sudden everyone will love 13. You'd think people will catch on and stop, but it literally happened with every entry in the series since Final Fantasy VIII came out. Some claim that's where the series died, and others claim that's where it truly took off. And somewhere in between this happening and the daily "Yo, Dante sucks and Lady is my waifu" thread, I decided I should stop browsing V. Anyway, the story starts with our hero Zidane and his theater group Tantalus. Tantalus isn't really a theater group though, as they are actually thieves that only stage plays as a distraction. And this time, they plan on kidnapping the princess of the Kingdom of Alexandria. However, within the first few hours of the game, their plans go tits up. Betrayal and plot twists happen, and before they know it, Zidane and his gang are caught right in the middle of a war between nations. Now, as is obviously JRPG tradition, a lot of vague and pretentious bullshit happens, convoluted plot twists, and of course all characters carry some kind of heavy emotional burden. However, FF9 is pretty easygoing about all of this, and it never lingers in sorrow for too long. Which is exactly why I like this game as much as I do. Now, I'm sure most of you are familiar with the now infamous emo androgynous male characters the Final Fantasy series is known for. And this game doesn't really have any of that. Really, it's more like a fun swashbuckling adventure with a hint of political intrigue here and there. And Zidane is more like an Indiana Jones type character. You know, always joking around and being a douche. Whenever the game tends to get a bit sad and up its own ass, it's usually Zidane who tells everyone to lighten the fuck up. Like, you're on an adventure, so you better fucking enjoy it. I mean, the game starts with a fucking play for fuck's sakes. There's no traumatized ex-soldiers or crybaby daddy issues to be found here. In fact, Final Fantasy IX actually saves most of its emotional bullshit till the very end. And by that point, you've most likely been wooed in by all of his charms, so you're actually bothered to give a fuck. Because, you know, writing and shit. Also, if you look at some of the other games in the series, they usually tend to drop you right in the middle of the action. And while this sometimes works, it more often than not just kind of puts you in a state of Compare the beginning of this game to that of Final Fantasy V, and you start to see how good this game actually is at building up to its moments. You just start out as a kid, who's on his way to go see a play. Nothing particularly special about it. And like I said, things do end up going wrong, but if this were any other game in the series, it probably would have started right in the midst of that, and then resort to flashbacks to explain itself later. Anyway, gameplay-wise, it's a pretty standard JRPG. Final Fantasy tends to be a series that wants to push the envelope with its gameplay, or at least try and experiment with it. And this game doesn't really do any of that. Square chose to do what Square does best, and therefore they stuck with something they actually knew shit about. So while it's definitely one of the more simple Final Fantasy games from a gameplay standpoint, it's also one of the more solid mechanically speaking. Now, because of it being a very standard JRPG, I'm only going to go over the things it does differently from the standard formula. Cause like I said in my Golden Sun review, I think everyone gets a basic idea what the gameplay is like when I say it's a turn-based JRPG with random encounters. Anyway, one of the things I like most about this game is the way it treats character classes. Thing is, the game doesn't have a job system, nor are any of the character skills particularly customizable. It'd be easy to think that this is a system that lacks any form of depth. And while it certainly isn't Final Fantasy VIII Junction's I'd say that this is by far the best system this game could have had. What I mean is that every character class or job is actually relevant to the plot and their personality. For instance, the fact that Vivi is a black mage actually means something other than just casts black magic. And the fact that Quina is a blue mage, a class that can learn enemy skills, is because she wants to learn more about other cultures. This isn't something you see very often in JRPGs, where there's usually a kind of dissonance between a character's personality and how they act or function in battle. Stuff like this usually doesn't go much farther than not being able to equip heavy armor to a possibly more fragile white mage character. But in Final Fantasy IX it does. And it leaves room for a more simple and easier to use system than what you might find in other games in the series. It basically breaks down the entire idea of RPG character development down to the very basics, being equipment. Equipment in this game doesn't just raise a character's attack or defense, it also carries a certain ability. Said ability will have a bar that'll fill up with ability points you earn after battles. Once the bar is full, you learn that ability. All the abilities you've acquired per character can be found on the ability screen of all places, where you can assign which abilities you'd like to be using. And really, that's basically it. No fiddling around with materia, license boards, and GF junctions or whatever. Also, simple doesn't necessarily mean there isn't a lot to fuck around with. Most of the depth here comes from what equipment you're using at which specific time. Certain abilities like Bird Killer or Undead Killer will make it so that the character using that ability will do more damage against birds or zombies. And since every area will have a set few monsters that'll only appear there, you'd do well to actually try and use those skills appropriately. Also, the game has this thing called a synthesis shop, where you can forge new weapons out of your old equipment. These weapons tend to be much more powerful than what you'd usually find in a regular weapon shop. Now, the combination of me using both abilities and synthesized weapons to my advantage made it so that I was hitting for about 500 HP worth of damage at level 8, when I would otherwise be hitting about 120 if I had used the weapons available at the weapon shop. Which really shows how far I could already take it this early on in the game. Either way, I spent a lot of time trying and buying all sorts of new equipment, and I had quite a lot of fun learning the ins and outs of the mechanics this way. Still, I can understand that fucking around in menus like this will likely seem a bit tedious to a lot of people. But it's not like the game is forcing you to do any of this. You can still play the game fine by just brute forcing your way through if you desire to do so. All that said though, there is one thing I really don't like about this game. And that's that the battles are so slow. Even on the fastest setting, the ATB gauge is still about as fast as a dead snail. And not only that, the battle animations take their sweet fucking time as well. The intro animations, the magic spells, using items, like every attack, they have to ready their weapons first, instead of just attacking right away. All of which gets even worse when you start using abilities like auto potion and counterattack, not to mention the excessive amount of time some enemies spend doing completely pointless things like darkening the screen slightly before an attack. Really, I've had moments where I counted well over 20 seconds of time in between selecting an attack and the actual execution. And I get that Square was just trying to make shit look nice, but if the technology simply wasn't good enough to do all of this at reasonable speeds, then maybe they should have just toned it down a little. Luckily, the encounter rate actually isn't all that high, and to make up for the slower battles, the game doesn't really expect you to grind anywhere either, which is pretty great. Also, while I know that there are a lot of people that actually really like grinding, I'm tempted to say that it's kind of bad game design when a game expects you to do it. If you ask me, a well-made RPG should be designed in a way that would allow you to beat the game by simply learning the mechanics. Having to level grind for hours just to be able to beat a boss even though you know what you're doing just feels like the game is unbalanced to me. And while I do realize that games like Dragon Quest VIII and Final Fantasy III are made like this on purpose and not out of incompetence, I still think it's kind of an iffy design choice. To me, it feels like they just unbalanced their game on purpose, only to lengthen the playtime, which really wasn't an uncommon thing to do during the arcade era. So maybe that design philosophy just snuck in there unintentionally. Either way, in this game you just have to kill most of everything you encounter, and you should be fine. I'm still not a huge fan of random encounters though, but I'm afraid that's just something I'm going to have to deal with. Like, it makes for a lot of those moments when you're just about to get that chest and... Now, you may have noticed that this game looks less anime and/or Swedish pop stars than most other games in the series. That's because the art direction is done by Hideo Minaba, instead of either Tetsuya Nomura or Yoshitaka Amano. So the game has more of a picture book fairy tale thing going on, and seems to go for a slightly more steampunkish vibe instead of the futuristic style of the last few games. Like, most of the backgrounds seem more like Victorian-era paintings than prog rock album covers. Again, it's very different from what the series eventually became and what it was already becoming in the games prior to this one. Final Fantasy IV and V already had space and aliens and shit going on, and by the time Final Fantasy VII came out, it seemed more like Mad Max or Blade Runner than anything. So, Final Fantasy IX really harkens back to a period in the series most modern fans weren't even around to play. I mean, I sure as hell wasn't. And for a guy who started with the 8th entry in the series, I gotta admit that it's pretty hard for me to go back to anything older than Final Fantasy VI. Still, it isn't uncommon for people to think of dragons, crystals, and magic when they think of the name Final Fantasy, which is why 9 became somewhat of a fan favorite. The game tried to encompass everything the series stood for at the time, and I think it did a pretty good job. And even if it didn't, the game still has some of the more cutest moments out of the entire series. Like I said, all the backgrounds almost feel like paintings, and the game really uses this to its advantage to create some pretty cool and diverse set pieces. There's lots of vibrant colors and tons of little details everywhere that made this world very believable to me. For instance, there's this seemingly unimportant house with a bird's nest in the attic thing. And over the course of the game, as you visit this place multiple times, the bird's eggs will hatch. It's little things like this that really made it seem to me like the world was actually alive. Something else that also contributes to this are the active time events, also known as ATEs. Basically, these are optional chunks of exposition that let you get a glimpse of what's happening to the characters around you. For instance, when you reach a new town, all the members of your party will split up and look around. When this happens, you get the option to watch the ATEs to find out what they're doing. It's usually nothing more than a little bit of a comedic moment, but I do really like how well they're implemented. I mean, it avoids a lot of needless exposition just to cram in some character development at times where it would probably be inappropriate. But because of the ATEs happening during exploration, it doesn't really feel out of place here at all. The same can be said about Mognet, which is a mail service used between save Moogles. Again, it isn't much, but being able to read the letters of these Moogles discussing events with each other gives the game a less intrusive way of giving more detail to its world and the events that occur in it. Also, while I'm on the topic of rambling about things I really like about this game, I'd like to say that this is by far the best sounding Final Fantasy in my opinion. And I'm not just talking about the soundtrack either. I mean, the music's great too, but I think it really nails sound design better than any game in the series. Simple things like the way the footsteps sound, or the owls in Evil Forest, and especially the sound of Steiner's armor as he runs around. And while I do realize that a lot of these are just stock library sound effects, it's more about the way how they're implemented that gives them their charm. in a similar fashion to how Akira Yamaoka uses Spectrasonic's distorted reality samples without really altering any of them, or how every Adult Swim cartoon uses stock Hanna-Barbera sound effects. It's not about what you use, but how you use it. Anyway, if it wasn't obvious enough, I really like this game a lot despite some of its flaws. And I should probably stop talking now, because this video has gone on for way too long.